Chapter 4. The Hark Hall. No, not a full-on mutant, but at least a deviation of the standard genetic template that was common for humans. Considering that all three of these people had the same kind of mutation, it was safe to assume a majority of the local populace would also possess this minor change in biology. But perhaps the change was deeper beneath the surface. If Lance truly possessed no bionics, then perhaps her skeletal structure was different from standard humans. Thicker bones, perhaps. If so, then wouldn't her limbs be broader than that? Lance and these men didn't seem any wider than a normal person. In fact, they seemed thinner, more lean. This construct here saved my life. Lance explained to the guards I deem it safe for its entry if it wishes, and I will take care to ensure it causes no harm. The guards looked to one another, sharing a concerned look, before turning their attention back to Lance, as the Watcher says, their life on the line. One of them said. Then they both stepped to the side, holding their spears tall, a real golem, by the pillars. One of them whispered with an awed stare for Hoplite. Lance merely nodded at the words and passed through the open gate wordlessly, with Hoplite following right behind her. The guards' eyes followed him as he walked through the gate behind Lance, and he could see them turning their heads to stare at his back. If they knew he could still see them by way of his rear camera, would they have still done that? Probably. Why would Lance's life be on the line? Perhaps it was a sort of warning that if a Watcher brought in a malignant stranger, there would be severe consequences. Hoplite would keep that in mind moving forward. A big risk, bringing in a man who had earlier threatened her to comply with his orders. Had she originally planned to lead him into a trap to attempt to neutralize him? That could still be a factor. Hoplite would keep on his guard in case of an ambush. After all, she did say, ensure he would cause no harm. The meaning behind those words could be manifold. As they passed into the forest, Hoplite could see the gate relower from his rear camera, aided by the prehensile roots. Did they somehow manage to train this creature to do that? How does one domesticate something like this? Would that really keep out the fiends? If these creatures were determined enough, they could likely scale the wall, aided by the many grooves afforded them by the dozens of roots making up its surface. That is unless this wall was capable of repelling climbers. If the roots could drink up a whole gate, why not suck in invaders attempting to climb it, crushing their bones or whipping them from its surface with its tendrils? The Hark Hall will be at the Ilum tree in the center of the bastion. We'll get there quicker if we run. Just ignore anyone who stares. We don't get a lot of visitors with a Watcher's blessing. Even less so when that visitor is a golem, Lance said, breaking into a run. Not that we'll see a lot of folk out tonight. We elves prefer to wander about during the day, though the fallen star is sure to have stirred a few from their homes. Hoplite followed suit, easily keeping her pace as they moved through the woods. Is that what these colonists called themselves? Elves. Alba. That was a fictional species, wasn't it? Hoplite distinctly remembered reading a book when he was but a child. A book that held a plethora of fantasy creatures within its pages, including elves. He hadn't thought about that book in years. He couldn't quite place a name to it anymore. It had to have been over 200 years since he had read it. From what he could remember, elves had pointed ears and lean frames, much like Lance and those guards had. Perhaps they had access to that novel and had decided to name their branch of humanity after the elves. It wasn't the most ridiculous name he'd seen branches come up with. This colony definitely had to have been lost before first contact with the final kind, based on Lance's initial reaction to him talking about it. She had seemed completely ignorant of what the final kind were. Perhaps she had misheard him earlier. Have your people made any contact with the final kind yet? Hoplite asked her. I know not what you speak of, she replied nearly instantly. That pretty much confirmed it. There was a chance that just Lance herself was ignorant of their existence, but that was slim. A lost colony from before the first contact era. These people had to have been alone for over 500 years at the very least. Yet, they still kept with Genesian standard. The language they spoke hadn't deviated at all since losing contact with Turna. An impressive feat, considering how long they had been isolated. During their entire sprint to reach the Harkhal, they had passed several dozen moving trees, some of which seemed to actually move out of their path as Lance and Hoplite approached. There were some elves that had been awakened by news of this falling star, all gawking at him wide-eyed as he followed after Lance. They were dressed in fine clothing, looking the furthest thing from destitute, but not appearing pompous. His earlier hypothesis was confirmed as he saw that all these people bore pointed ears. Unlike Lance, these other elves seemed to have bright blonde hair, so much so they almost seemed to be white. Thankfully, none tried to stop them as they made way for this Ilum tree. At some point, he would need to clarify to Lance that this falling star was nothing more than his escape shuttle. For these elves to call it such was odd. Why not immediately assume it was a meteorite? It was primitive to think that a star could fall. Perhaps these people had regressed more than he initially thought. Further and further they went, passing the occasional elf or moving tree, the landscape otherwise unchanging, save for the thick roots jutting up from the earth. As they drew closer to the Ilum tree, Hoplite noticed massive roots rising up from the earth in patches, all seemingly leading toward the center of these woods. The most notable thing about these large roots had to be that they bore that very same green glow as the root wall. The moving trees didn't bear this glowing green glow in their own writhing tendrils. Were these roots running all the way back to the bastion? They then entered a clearing at long last, bare of any trees but gently writhing with glowing green roots, overtop midnight dark soil. If these were coming from the center, then that must mean that the largest tree Hoplite had ever seen came into view, easily towering over the highest skyscraper. Had there been any clouds in the sky, he doubted he'd be able to see the huge branches high above, their huge leaves casting a massive shadow on the comparably tiny forest below. Despite its size, the tree was almost difficult to see in the night, for its bark was a deep obsidian hue, the green moonlight illuminating its black silhouette. For a moment, he slowed his stride, taking in the immensity of this impossible creature. This pillar of darkness that split the sky in twain. This tree had to be as large, no larger than the sparrow. How was it even possible that he didn't see this on entry? In fact, how had he not seen it looming in the night sky? How didn't he see it from the sparrow itself while he was in orbit? Perhaps it simply hadn't been quite that large, but still. Impressive, isn't it? Lance asked Ancient One. I'm sure even one of you could appreciate the majesty of the Ilum tree. You said it was a big tree. Hoplite told her, still marveling at the thing. Did I lie? Lance asked with a gesture towards the Ilum tree, a tinge of sarcasm in her tone. No, Hoplite replied. How did this creature not destroy all other plant life around it? For a creature of such size to exist here, the surrounding wilderness should be a barren wasteland. How nutrient-dense was this soil? Was it an adult version of those moving trees he saw earlier? Were those its young? The questions whirled through his mind uncontrollably, frustrating him until he turned his focus back to the task at hand. How do we reach the Harkhal? It should have happened already, she said, slowing to a brisk walk. We still haven't been taken. What do you mean? In a single millisecond, everything around them suddenly vanished. The dark night outside had instantly changed into a large, brightly lit circular chamber of gnarled brown wood. Shocked, he immediately raised the Magnus, aiming it at the dozens of elves suddenly surrounding his position above him. They were all seated in benches that had seemingly been grown from the wood beneath their feet, sitting high above Lance and Hoplite. A glowing yellow crystalline structure pulsed above, in the center of the ceiling, suspended by glowing green roots that seemed too thin to hold up the tank-sized crystal's weight. It had to be around 100 feet up from where Hoplite stood. If it fell, then it would crush him and Lance both, as the crystal's circumference matched that of the pit they now stood in. It likely wouldn't kill him, as the adamantium plating of the Phalanx armor was sturdy enough to withstand practically anything. The trauma from all that force passing through the suit might prove to be an issue, though. Had that been Lance's plan from the start? To crush Hoplite beneath the weight of that crystal. Time seemed to come to a standstill for a moment, as Hoplite's coprocessor worked to speed his thinking. He would neutralize her after he escaped from this pit. That would be no issue. Those were easily scalable so long as he built up enough momentum. Hoplite would climb up, eliminate Lance and any other hostiles in the area, before capturing the unarmed traitors above. Yet, he hesitated for just that brief instant. Why would Lance lure him into a trap that would just get her killed as well? After all, there was no easy escape from the deadfall trap above. Perhaps if she hugged the wall. If Lance tried to climb up and out of the pit while telling Hoplite to stay put, then he would know for sure that it was a trap. But until that happened, he'd not open fire. Not yet. With that decided, time appeared to resume. All these thoughts had passed through Hoplite's mind in just that one instant. The Gitmus Tech coprocessor installed in his brain again proving its worth. It's okay, Lance shouted, trying and failing to push the barrel of his gun downward. We're here. This is the Harkhal. Hoplite wouldn't remove his finger from the trigger or lower his shotgun until he was absolutely certain that nothing in this chamber was of any immediate danger to him. The fact that Lance did not scamper off towards any of the gnarled walls helped to convince him that this was indeed not a convoluted deadfall trap. But he'd not dropped his guard yet. The 10 elves in the high seats seemed to not care about the weapon Hoplite aimed at them. They were as stony-faced as he himself was, though none would be able to see Hoplite's expression through the helmet. The golden glow of the crystal illuminated their well-dressed forms, each wearing well-made wool or clinging silks. Hoplite hoped that his shock at being teleported hadn't been shown through his body language, but he was certain it had. After all, teleportation was supposed to be impossible, even for the final kind. What could these people be capable of if they could achieve something so utterly unfeasible? He would need to confiscate that equipment, whatever it was, as soon as the opportunity presented itself. It could change the tide in the war, a war they had already lost. He internally berated himself for the thought. Hoplite was still alive, and so were the humans that escaped the Sparrow. As long as even a few of them remained, the war was still ongoing. He then turned his attention back to the situation at hand. A circular wall penned Hoplite and Lance below the elves, who continued to stare down at them disapprovingly. There were 10 sets of eyes there, all looking expectant. He then noticed that those disapproving glares were directed at Lance, not himself. Lance stared back up at him pleadingly, still trying to bring the barrel of the gun down, please. She whispered urgently. Hesitantly, he complied, remembering the words those gate guards had spoken to her earlier. Hoplite did not lower his guard, though. He would be ready to bring up his shotgun to blast the instant something went awry. She nodded thankfully and turned her gaze toward the elves above. I, as a watcher of the wood, have come to deliver important news, she announced loudly. Out with it then, Lancella. A matriarchal elf woman said coldly. Matriarchal, but she bore no wrinkles to show as much. It was those bright green eyes that conveyed the impression, showing wisdom beyond her years. Perhaps elves could live longer than normal humans, as in that book he had read as a child. She had horrendously long blonde hair that fell around her seat in waves, spilling over to brush the bare wood beneath her feet. Hoplite couldn't even imagine the hassle of caring for a tenth of that mop. Why had this woman grown it out so long? She then looked from Lance to him, her pale green eyes seeming to glow as they took him in from head to foot. Hoplite blinked and visibly shook his head before looking the elf woman over again. She really was a gorgeous woman, he supposed. Those thick curves, that perfect symmetrical face, that pale supple skin, the way that tight high-neck silk dress clung to her form. She looked so proper, yet so sultry and seductive. Hoplite suddenly felt a wave of dizziness come over him. She truly was the most beautiful woman he had ever. Hoplite felt frozen for a millisecond before he was able to finally tear his eyes away from that bright gaze. What on earth was he thinking of? Where had those intrusive thoughts come from? He would need to submit himself to the seventh arm if these base urges return. Hoplite should not feel that way. The woman seemed taken aback for the briefest of instants, before her face resumed that cool, stony calm, looking quickly from Hoplite to Lance. None of the others spoke. Fiends have come close to the Bastion Harkmother. I swear it on my family and honor. They are no more than a few miles from here. Lance told them, her words slicing through the silence like a razor. We must call the tongues for aid, even Akandar, if we must. If the fiend war has fallen, the death spiral will spread. The Harkhal all looked to each other wide-eyed, some even gasping aloud. Those who had gasped put hands to mouths, looking embarrassed. For what? Hoplite had no idea. But the Harkmother spared quick, withering glances to those who had. Also, Lance said, drawing their attention back to her, this golem saved my life and brought me here to deliver this news. I asked to allow it sanctuary until it is ready to move on. Lance told them, gesturing to Hoplite. No. The Harkmother said, crossing her arms, I know for a certainty that this golem is a human, she said, staring at him, and a strong-minded one at that. She added thoughtfully, my gaze held him no longer than an untrained hand on a slipfish. But the fact it held him at all reveals his true nature. You've brought a human into the Harkhal, Lancelot, but at no fault of yours. She continued more sympathetically, unfortunately. This still means that you must be stripped of rank. We will allow you to stay in the Farwood as you wish, but you will never watch again. Forgive me, I do not wish this upon you. But a mistake of this caliber, made by a watcher, must be punished. As Draui decrees. Lance went wide-eyed, staring dumbfounded at Hoplite before falling to her knees. That's not fair. We allow men into the Farwood, and even the Bastion sometimes, she said, a stutter to her voice, as she stared up at the harp. Suddenly, anger flashed in her eyes and seeped into her voice. I didn't know he was human, I swear it. Draui must have decreed something for a situation like this. You cannot strip my place, she shouted desperately. I do not doubt you, but it is as Foundation commanded millennia ago. The Harkhal does not question the will of the Pillar Gods, Lanceley. I am sorry, but you are dead to the Watchers now, the Harkmother said with a regretful tinge to her tone. There are other societies you can join, perhaps the Tree Hunters, or the Bramble Guard, she asked, attempting to sound soothing. Lance said nothing, merely sitting there and staring up at the gathered members of the Harkhal with disbelief. The other members of the hall averted their gaze from Lance's pleading eyes, shame plain on their faces. All except for one, an elf man with blonde hair and fiery red eyes. That elf glared down at Lance with barely contained anger, a large vein bulging on his reddening face, as if a hot tube of magma lay just beneath his pale flesh. The Harkmother herself actually seemed to be genuinely displeased with this outcome. Perhaps there could be a way for Hoplite himself to change things. There are certain aspects about him that weren't technically classified. He could not go into details, else Hoplite would have no choice but to kill every single living being in this room. He had to word this carefully, but first, Hoplite needed to know what these elves had planned for him. What do you intend to do with me? Hoplite asked in a flat tone. Well, there isn't a specific law for a situation such as this. No human has ever set foot in the Harkhal. She explained Foundation never told our forefathers a protocol for if this were to happen, she said, voice trailing off as she placed a finger to her chin, brow furrowed. I'm not completely human. Hoplite told her so. You must restore Lance's rank. Everyone in the chamber stared at the Harkmother, even Lance, who wore a confused expression. My eyes make human men, unable to resist my allure. It is how I test uncertain visitors. She told him I felt your eyes on me, lustful and hungry as you felt mine on yours. I resisted. He told her, by your laws, I believe that you must restore her rank. Silence passed between the members of the Harkhal, all seeming to stare deeply into one another's eyes. Why weren't they saying anything? Another elf, a tall, lean fellow with long black hair and smooth features, shot a glance at the Harkmother. They both stared at one another for a long while before finally she smiled. While a pure-blooded human is not allowed by Draui's law within this hall, I suppose that one such as you would not count as a full-on human. Geralt tells me you are certainly part man, part something else. By technicality, I rule that Lance keeps her rank as Watcher, she said, the relief in her voice seeming genuine. This cannot be, the angry, red-eyed elf shouted, standing from his bench to glare down at Hoplite. He was a short elf, thin with nary a muscle stitched onto his willowy frame. His angry red eyes stared out from beneath a brow that seemed always furrowed in a glare, focused completely on Lance. Even if he possesses the smallest drop of human blood, Foundation has ruled that she must be stripped of rank. You will not bend the rules of our Lord Draui? he shouted, a vein popping on his forehead, as his voice echoed through the chamber. Perhaps a new member should be chosen as speaker, as our good mother is clearly incompetent. The elf spat, his voice laced with flaming venom. You break even the most basic of rules by simply speaking aloud, Turlin. Do not preach to me about bending rules when you yourself outright break them. The Hark Mother replied coolly, lifting a slender brow and smirking as if she were amused in the millennia that you have served the Hall Fire Eyes. You had always obeyed every rule to perfection, but today you have violated that. Perhaps we should strip you of your undeserved position among us. After all, an elf that acts the child has no place here in the Hark Hall. Perhaps you should simply stay silent, she emphasized with a cool glare, else I may decide to begin a new vote as soon as this session is concluded. One that may result in your replacement with someone more suited to such a mature role. Turlin opened his mouth again, but before he could utter another word, the entire Hall of Elves honed in on the man. Whatever Turlin had been about to say was stuffed back down his throat with an awkward cough. Turlin then averted his gaze from the other elves, his jaw clenched tightly, to the point where Hoplite believed that the elf might just crack a tooth. How this man was ever elected to this seemingly important place amongst elven society, Hoplite did not know. Soon after that, the other members of the hall began staring into one another's eyes, with Turlin eventually looking up to meet the Hark Mothers. Fiery red met brilliant green, and the two glared at one another for a long while. Hoplite was not sure as to what they were doing, but he was slowly growing irritated with the time this meeting was taking. After a few more agonizingly long minutes, the Hark Mother finally spoke. It is done. You will retain your rank as Watcher, Lancelot Trinket. Lance quickly stood, bowing to the Hark Mother and then quickly turning to beam up at Hoplite. Thank you, Hoplite. I won't forget this, truly, she whispered with a grateful smile. He nodded and looked from Lance, or Lancelot, according to the Hark Mother, to the dark-haired elf man who must have been Jeroval. Clearly, these elves were capable of communicating with one another via eye contact alone. Or perhaps the eye contact was just something of cultural significance to these people. No, they had to be communicating somehow, else they would have not reached any kind of decision today. Did they all possess matching communication implants? More important than this eye contact communication, however, was Jeroval himself. He had confirmed to the Hark Mother that Hoplite was indeed not fully human. But if Jeroval knew that, then he somehow must have had intel on Project Chimera. Chapter 5. The Hark's request. Hoplite stared up at Jeroval without tilting his helmet in that direction. If the elf somehow knew about Project Chimera and wasn't authorized, well, Hoplite would have no choice if Jeroval mentioned it. What would happen after that point was completely out of Hoplite's hands. Yet, it was impossible that Jeroval could have any information about Chimera, for the program had begun long after this colony had been lost. There was no use racking his brain now for answers. Hoplite needed to obtain more intel. Blundering about in the dark was a fruitless endeavor. He'd just have to see what he could suss out of these elves, now that your previous meeting is concluded. Hoplite began in his standard monotone. I have questions for you. And you. What is your name, sir? The Hark Mother asked. I thought I heard Lancelot mention it earlier. It is Hoplite, yes? Hoplite nodded. Affirmative. It sounds foreign. Yet you don't have an accent. Are you from the Blastlands, perhaps? Where did you come from? The Hark Mother asked, brushing a stray lock of blonde hair behind her pointed ear. I would prefer to keep that classified," Hoplite replied flatly. There was no telling how these people would react if Hoplite told them the truth. If they knew that he had come from a so-called falling star, they might cease talks with him completely, maybe even become aggressive. Hoplite was not sure. Almost immediately after Hoplite spoke, the elves all began gazing into one another's eyes, long moments passing between each one before they all honed in to stare at the Heart Mother. She looked to each member in turn before finally turning her green gaze down on Hoplite again. "Speak your questions," she said, her voice echoing in the otherwise silent chamber. "How long have you been out of contact with Turna?" Hoplite asked, tilting his head toward the Heart Mother. "And do you have any radio equipment that I can utilize?" The Heart Mother quirked a brow, then turned away from Hoplite, looking a question into the eyes of each of the sitting elves. Each stare held a certain focus, their eyes shifting while maintaining contact. Oddly, the Heartcall seemed to shift between facial expressions, as if they were holding a conversation with the Heart Mother with just their eyes. Some appeared to be listening intently or shaking their heads as if the Heart Mother had asked them a question. It was like she was speaking with each member, yet she said nothing, and neither did anyone else. So they had bionic implants installed in their brain that allowed for mental communication. But then, where were the metal discs that should have been filling their temples? Every officer he had seen with that particular bionic all bore those shining metal discs on their temples. Perhaps it was a newer model, one that did not require an external access hatch for maintenance, on a backwater lost colony from before that bionic was even invented. No, something else was going on here. Clearly, they had developed an advanced form of communication with nothing but their eyes. It seemed to be their own kind of sign language, with them somehow being able to decipher meaning through eye movements and facial expressions alone. Lance shifted slowly from foot to foot, slowly creeping closer to Hoplite, until she was practically standing on his toes, leaning up toward his helmet and cupping a hand around her mouth. "They can communicate without speaking," she whispered. "It is their way, but they must maintain eye contact. Isn't that classified intel you're providing me?" Hoplite asked. "You could be punished for telling me this." Lance shook her head. "Not at all. Everyone knows it. But you seem out of the loop. Just wanted to clear up any confusion." "Affirmative," Hoplite replied as Lance backed away once more. That confirmed it. It was an incredibly intricate system of communication, but no bionic was involved. How did one learn to read eye movements to communicate so clearly? Hoplite shifted his eyes to hers, not moving his head as he did so. "You won't be disciplined if you speak." She shook her head with a small smile. "Only if I talk while the Heart Mother speaks. Discussion between us is fine as long as we aren't disruptive." "Affirmative," Hoplite said. Lance smiled, and Hoplite thought that she was going to back away further. But instead, she continued to speak. "Thank you again for helping me out." Lance whispered. "You didn't have to go out of your way for me, but you did." Hoplite cocked his helmet toward her. "I was ignorant of local law and compromised your occupation." He explained simply, "It is not necessary for you to be discharged." "Well, I still feel grateful," she whispered. "So, if you don't mind me asking you," she said slowly, "if you aren't fully human, what are you, classified?" "I will not continue speaking of this," he said curtly. Chimera was never to be spoken of. It would be fatal if mentioned by name. Lance inched away from him. Sorry. I won't bother you with it, friend. If you want to keep it a secret, I will not press you. She finished, moving to stand next to him. Hoplite's brow furrowed at the parting words. Friend. It was wrong to treat a hoplite as such. He was a thing, just as Commander had taught him. Nothing more. One did not take a wrench and claim it as a friend. It was no different with a hoplite. We have not heard of this Turner you speak of, the Heart Mother said, drawing his attention back up to her. Nor do we have this radio equipment you ask after. I do apologize. Disappointment filled him, but Hoplite stuffed it down. He wouldn't let them hear it in his tone. Then you have been out of contact for a long time. You are originally from the Turnan Empire. We have colonized many worlds. Hoplite explained you are a colony that lost contact with us hundreds of years ago. Hoplite expected questions or odd gasps as they heard his words. All he got was a few amused looks and shaking heads. They denied it, the plain truth that he had laid right before them. They really had regressed far, but a few hundred years shouldn't have been enough for them to forget Turna. Right? They are surely Turnan, if not in their way of life, then in the language they spoke. You are from this Turna, the Hark Mother began. At least now we know where you are from. You say that these people have colonized different worlds? She asked, letting the question hang for a few seconds before continuing. Tell me, are you from this world? So they didn't outright claim that other worlds didn't exist. They were at least aware that there were other planetary bodies in space besides this one. Hoplite supposed that he had let it slip earlier that he was from Turna, not this world, but their reaction to this information was not as primitive as Hoplite had suspected it may be. Best to be truthful here, seeing as they weren't being aggressive about it. No, I am from Earth. He told them simply, your homeworld. Very well, the Hark Mother said, narrowing her eyes at Hoplite as she did so. Hoplite, this world is known as Akulis. Can you tell me how it is that you have arrived here? I came from my ship, from next to your moon. Hoplite told them the one you can see in your orbit was the ship of our enemies. Your enemies, the final kind. Our enemies? The Hark Mother asked a ship next to the moon. Final kind. The rest of the Hark Hall began exchanging looks with one another, shifting again between facial expressions, as if they were reacting to spoken words. So they were well and truly ignorant of the final kind. Of that there could be no doubt now. This colony had to have been lost before first contact. After a few moments of this silent communication, the Hark Mother spoke again. Your ship, how does it float next to the moon? And is the larger ship from this final kind still a danger? The Hark Mother asked, her brow slightly creasing above worried eyes. He did not feel like explaining the mechanics of space travel to these people. That could come at another time from someone better capable of conveying such information. Hoplite shook his head visibly, causing a few members of the Hark Hall and even Lance to let out relief. Breeze, no. The ship has been neutralized. Final kind troops may have made it planetside, however. Have you encountered any of their forces? He asked the Hark Mother. Hoplite's throat was beginning to feel slightly worn from all this speaking. He was not used to it. The Hark Mother shook her head. No, we have not. What are they? An alien imperium that wants to subjugate humanity, and you by extension. Hoplite told them, maintaining his monotone. More looks passed between the hall. Then, after a few minutes, the Hark Mother spoke once more. We will prepare for the event of an encounter with these creatures. You do realize what you are, where you are. I am a hoplite, and I'm on a lost Turnen world. Hoplite told her. The Hark Mother shook her head. No, you are an outworlder. Garaval tells me that he sees not a drop of Zod's blood in you. At the mention of that, Garaval winced. It was a small expression, a slight lift of the brows and biting of the cheek. So Garaval did know about Chimera. Or had he lied about some of the information that he had provided to the Hark Mother? And what was this about Garaval seeing Hoplite's blood? That can only mean one thing. Be you man or some other creature, you are from another realm of existence. She then leaned forward, eyes intent. Tell me, Hoplite, were you the star that fell in our forest? Hoplite shook his head. Impossible. Different dimensions do not exist, and that was not a star. It was my escape shuttle. It is the only possible explanation for your strange appearance, the odd ship in the sky, and the fact that you do not bear the blood of Zod. The Hark Mother told him all the races on Oculus, at the beginning of its creation, were formed from the infinite blood of Zod, the pillar god of might. We have seen your ilk before on this world, though none have appeared in this current age, at least none that we know of anyhow. This star or shuttle, as you claim, is clearly otherworldly in origin as well. This too points to your true nature. The Hark Mother then took a deep breath, giving a long sigh before continuing. I suppose your arrival is a good omen. Outworlders have a long history of benefiting our world when they visit. What history remains of them, anyhow? It surely is a sign from the Pillar Gods that we are headed into a golden age. A backwoods mythology that had no place in Turnen society. These people would unfortunately have to be re-indoctrinated at another time. Hoplite would not be the one to conduct the process. He had neither the training or the means at his disposal to conduct re-indoctrination, nor the will to do it to someone else, not after it had happened to him. Personnel more suited to the task would have to take care of it later. Now, this talk of Outworlders could only mean that they indeed did have contact with Turnen personnel at one point, though based on the Hark Mother's talk of none in this age implied that it had been a long while since then. He cocked his head toward Garaval as he asked his own question, taking care to word it in a way that would avoid mention of Chimera. How does he know about my lineage? Hoplite asked. His eyes allow him to see the twisting ladders of the blood. The Hark Mother replied immediately, and without a drop of sarcasm. Hoplite stared. The twisting ladders of the blood. Surely she must mean DNA, but why would she say it like that? More importantly, how could Garaval see Hoplite's DNA? There was no bionic capable of that. Was he lying about having this alleged ability to avoid mention of Chimera? No. The Hark Mother hadn't hesitated before telling Hoplite about it, meaning that this was already established intel between these elves. Hoplite was still certain that this colony had been lost far before Chimera had begun, but was that really the case? After all, these elves still spoke in fluent Gynesian, meaning that it was likely that not too much time had passed since this colony had been lost. Yet the lack of knowledge about the final kind conflicted with this theory. as did the apparent lack of bionics. If Jaraval really had no way of knowing about Chimera, then how was it possible that the elf could see Hoplite's DNA? The way a Hawk Mother had spoken of it implied that only Jaraval alone was capable of doing this. A question then burned within Hoplite. Why could Jaraval do this? How did he do it? Hoplite needed to know. How can he see my blood? Hoplite asked, cocking his helmet back toward the Hawk Mother. His Daka, or to put it in more human terms, his eye magic allows him to do so. The Hawk Mother replied, again with no sarcasm. Hoplite shook his head. He would not be drawn into such fancies as eye magic. Unfortunately, at this point in time, Hoplite had no idea how to disprove such a claim. Unless these colonists had developed new tech while outside of Turna's influence. Perhaps, but maybe figuring out that tech should be left to one of the scientists that had been aboard the Sparrow. They would be more capable than Hoplite at deciphering new technology. Now then, if this mutated branch had specific rules against humans entering this place, then that must mean that the standard branch of humans still existed somewhere on this planet. Primitive or not, Hoplite desired to make contact with them at some point. Hopefully soon, depending on what happened here today. Where is the nearest human settlement? Hoplite asked the Hawk Mother. If you mean to find the largest gathering of humans possible, then you seek Akandar, the Hawk Mother said in a borderline withering tone. It lies far to the west of our forest, all the way to the coast of Feanor, the continent you currently stand upon. There is one other, smaller settlement to the east of here, as well as smaller townships along the way to Akandar. Yet one such as you would seek Akandar, as that would be where the most important humans on Feanor reside. I do assume that you would like to speak to humans with authority. You will find them there. She finished in a confident tone. Yes, Hoplite replied. Do they have transportation ballistics? How far had these humans regressed? Did they still have vehicles and guns, or had they gone back to spears and horses? Yes, they do have ballistas and horses, some of the finest on Arculus, in fact, though few would be able to carry you, I think. The Hawk Mother replied, I do mean no offense, sir, but you look quite heavy. That practically confirmed the latter. Still, though, perhaps they weren't as backward as these mutants. Maybe they even still knew of Turna, or maybe forces from the Sparrow could be heading there. He almost hung his head, but kept it upright. The crew would be more likely to have landed in the east, based on the planet's rotation during the evacuation, not the west. Currently, the main objective should be to reunite with the Sparrow's crew, not re-establish contact with lost colonists. That would be taken care of by those better able to talk sense into the locals. How was it that I was teleported here? Hoplite asked. Teleportation had been declared to be physically impossible by top second-arm scientists. They still had tried, of course, but no matter what they did, the second arm had never been able to accomplish it. Even the final kind with their superior tech were still completely incapable of teleportation. Yet, the impossible had happened to Hoplite today, and he would know how. The Hawk crystal above, the Hawk Mother said, sparing a glance for the glowing amber crystal suspended overhead, the pillar god Draui, formed it for us elves out of the golden flame of foundation. The power of our god draws those with the intent to seek the Harkor here. Hoplite remained silent. Clearly this crystal was really an unidentified element. Somehow, it was capable of teleporting matter, and would have to be confiscated. But how would he go about doing that? There were no visible exits to this room, and he could think of no safe way to procure the crystal without accidentally damaging it. But teleportation, it could shift the tide of the war, a war that Turna had already lost. Again, he stuffed that invasive thought far into the recesses of his mind. As long as Hoplite was alive, the war was not over. As long as any Turnan fought, the war was not over. Humanity would not lose. He glanced up at the crystal again, not tilting his helmet. There really was no way for him to take it now, though. No exits, no safe means of retrieving it. No, it would simply have to remain here for now. There would be personnel better suited to retrieving it at another time. Hoplite realized he had been having repeating thought processes during this whole meeting. It will be taken care of later. It will remain here for now. It would be handled by personnel with more experience in this. An unsettling thought occurred to him then. What if he was the only personnel left? What if the Sparrow's crew all died on landing? Either from a violent crash landing or from the final kind. He took a deep breath. No, they would be survivors. Hoplite would not give up on that hope. Now on to the creatures he had killed upon landing. What are fiends? Hoplite asked. The Harkmother's eyes fell from him then, and she spoke in an almost mournful tone. Poor souls, are they, taken by the death spiral curse. Forced to inflict pain they are, though it be not their choice. Are they animated by any kind of nanotech? Hoplite asked immediately after she finished speaking. It was a silly question considering who Hoplite spoke to, but he had to ask. The Harkmother's eyes shot up to Hoplite before then shifting to the other members of the Hark Hall, who stared at him as if he were some kind of alien creature. Well, he supposed in a strange way he was. Lance quirked a brow at him then, but didn't say anything. Clearly Lance had wanted to ask just what nanotech was, but she must have realized that the Harkmother would ask that very question shortly. No, the curse is what drives them. What is this? Nanotech? The Harkmother asked, confirming Hoplite's thought. Microscopic machines, he told her. The Harkmother stared with a furrowed brow. So, they are tiny constructs? Affirmative. Hoplite told her with a nod. Nanomachines are thousands of tiny machines working in tandem to achieve a particular function. What mage can bind so many constructs at once? The size of the construct doesn't matter. Every individual animated object takes great effort to bind. The most powerful of mages can bind 3 at most. The Harkmother asked him, leaning forward in her rooted seat. Hoplite then noticed Turlan glaring at him, those red eyes accentuated by popping veins. When he noticed the glare, Hoplite turned his helmet in that direction, meeting that crimson gaze. After a few seconds, Turlan looked away to glare at Lance instead. She didn't seem to notice the glare at all, her eyes still glued to the Harkmother. Turlan may turn hostile later. Hoplite would be keeping an eye on the red-eyed elf. There's no magic involved, Hoplite replied sternly, cocking his helmet back to glance up at the Harkmother. Just advanced AI. The Harkmother had opened her mouth, likely readying to ask just what an AI was, when suddenly, literally, out of nowhere, based on what he read on his motion tracker, another Watcher appeared. Out of thin air he came, his clothing the mirror image of Lance's, with a couple jaw-shaped tears in his outfit. From the looks of it, those bites had barely missed flesh while pulling away the cloth. The elf then fell to his knees and rasped, "The fiend wall has fallen. Fiends are pouring through unopposed." Everything fell silent, and a cold stillness came over the chamber. Hoplite himself was staring wide-eyed at the sudden appearance of the Watcher. There had been no indication that this man was approaching on the motion tracker. Hoplite hadn't seen him coming with his cameras either. The man had simply popped into existence from nowhere. No, not nowhere. The crystal had teleported him based on what the Hark Mother had said. Teleported him not solely based on proximity, but sheerly by intent from what Hoplite had learned. Was that true? How did the crystal tell the intent of the person wanting to be brought here? He had no answer. Lancella, recite the Watcher's silence for our earlier meeting. The Hark Mother commanded in a voice that brooked no argument. Lance then dropped to her knees and said loudly, "My lips are sealed by the golden flame of foundation. Nothing from this chamber I have heard will be uttered to anyone save for those currently present until I am given permission by the Hark Mother." The Hark Mother nodded and sighed. "I do hope Gali has roused his defenders in time. Do you know if those who live in the wall have perished?" The new elf shook his head as Lance stood. "No. I only have heard that fiends are pouring en masse through our forest. I have heard a portion of the wall had just collapsed. They are heading for the bastion as we speak. I ran as fast as I could when I got word, and was beset upon by lesser fiends. Then we must mobilize," the Hark Mother declared, turning her gaze upon the other elves in the hall. "Every off-duty Watcher must take up arms and purge the Fallwood of this menace by any means necessary. The Bramble Guard must be rallied, and patrols will be doubled. Spread the word," she ordered in a steely tone that Captain Stowe would have applauded. The Hark Mother then looked to Hoplite. Her eyes intent. "Hoplite, you are a warrior, yes?" "Affirmative," he told her honestly. "Then I must ask you to aid in destroying the fiends. They pose a danger to my people, and—" the Hark Mother began. "Affirmative," Hoplite repeated, cutting her off. The Hark Mother stared wide-eyed, whether in shock at being interrupted or at Hoplite's willingness to fight with no hesitation. He did not know. It was simply his role as a Hoplite. He must defend humanity in all its forms from those that would cause harm to it. There was no question to what his answer would have been. At least it was so to Hoplite. These elves truly had no idea what a Hoplite was. Otherwise, they wouldn't have asked. "I thank you," the Hark Mother said slowly. "I must be honest. I had sought to pressure you into this, had you refused." The Hark Mother admitted with a sigh, "Upon your landing, you, no doubt, had destroyed several of our trees," she continued, Hoplite nodding in confirmation of her accusation. She blinked in surprise. "I thank you for not trying to be deceitful. Honesty goes a long way with most members of this hall, so we thank you. If they did decide to try and punish him, though, Hoplite would have no choice but to defend himself. He could not allow himself to fall victim to whatever backward laws the elves followed. Normally, this would require a dire punishment, but given your unique nature as an Outworlder, it is no surprise that you would be completely ignorant of our laws. Even outsiders who had never set foot in the Fallwood, at the very least, know not to harm our trees. However, you were uniquely innocent in your demolition. You simply could not have known." The Hark Mother continued, sparing a glare for Turlin, as the blonde elf's face turned a much deeper shade of crimson. "There will still be a vote to decide for a certainty. The role of Hark Mother is not that of a queen, but I am sure that most other members will find the logic in my words." She told him I just hoped the Fae that inhabited those trees fled when they had the chance. Destroying our forest is grounds for harsh punishment, but killing a Fae of the wood is a death sentence. She emphasized, holding up a single finger. A tree cannot regrow if its Fae is slain. They are the very life of our woods. She continued, lowering her finger. Now that your ignorance of their importance has been quashed, you will have no excuses should it happen again. Hoplite said nothing in response. They could have their vote if they wished, but it meant nothing to him. By every single metric, Hoplite was above their laws, and as such would not subject himself to their judgment. There was no such thing as Fae or spirits. A tree was just a tree. The Hark Mother then cleared her throat, turning to Lance. Watch Hoplite, she commanded. Lance nodded without hesitation, but said nothing, turning to stare at Hoplite. Watch him. Likely they didn't want Hoplite moving about their territory unsupervised. He would not argue the point. Hoplite just hoped that Lance could keep up with him. I will put you under the command of Knight, Captain Muro. The Hark Mother said he is a brilliant tactician and negative. Hoplite cut her off. He will not understand how to utilize my capabilities. I will operate to my full capacity without orders from someone who doesn't understand just what I am. The Hark Mother seemed to glare at Hoplite a moment before speaking. You will not cut me off again, Hoplite. You will show proper respect to the Hark Hall, Outworlder or no. She told him in a cold voice like steel. Besides, you do not know our woods. Muro can guide you to where you'll need to be. Lance flinched at hearing that tone, and she peered up at Hoplite, as if to see if he were injured. It would be against protocol to allow an officer outside of the Eighth Arm to order Hoplite. If he defied protocol, he would have to be re-indoctrinated. Hoplite could not allow that to happen again. The Hark Mother did make a good point, though. Hoplite didn't know these woods as well as the locals would have. But then again, if Lance was going to watch him, Lance can guide me through the forest. He said I can't get lost with her being with me. It was true based on how he had seen her move through the woods, as if through her own house. These words produced a strange reaction from the Hark Hall, and especially Lance, who stared at him with her jaw agape. She snapped it shut, and then looked to the floor, tangling a hand in her long black hair, and hiding her face with the other. The Hark Mother seemed to be amused by this based on how she quirked a brow at Lance. Hoplite didn't understand why those words would provoke such a reaction from them. But at the moment, it didn't really matter. The Hark Mother opened her mouth to speak again, but Hoplite overrode her. Every second we spend talking, Hoplite began, the ache in his throat giving his voice a more gravelly tone. More fiends come through the fiend wall. Teleport me out and I will take care of them the best way I can. The Hark Mother lifted her chin to stare down her nose at Hoplite. Very well. I will not argue when you speak sense. Go, but when we speak here again, you will give the proper courtesy and respect due to this hall. I thank you for your aid. But again, now that, she continued, narrowing her eyes at Hoplite, you will not destroy any more of our trees. And just as they had entered the Hark Hall, they had left. He and Lance both were teleported back outside, to the massive field of outspread roots in an instant. The Ilum tree loomed tall in the night sky, covering half of the full green moon overhead. Well, Lance said with a sigh, since that's taken care of, I suppose we're going to be working together to drive off the fiends. Now, the Hawk Mother said not to destroy any of the trees. Just so you know, what she means by that is utter destruction. A few scrapes and nicks here and there won't be a problem for a Fae to recover from, and the tree spirits usually know when it's time to flee. Avoiding hurting the forest is preferable, she continued with a sigh, but considering your preference for thunder staves, I think it'll be impossible. She paused, scratching her cheek anyway. I have to watch you, meaning I'm partly responsible for any damage you might cause. For both our sakes, she said, gesturing to herself and to Hoplite, try to mitigate the damage you might cause to our trees. Now, she said slowly before drawing two long daggers out from a pair of leather sheaths tied to her waist. The metal gleamed in the moonlight, and she gave the twin blades a smile. Each as long as her forearm, these should do for me. I would ask to borrow one of those thunder staves you have, but frankly, those things scare me, so I'll stick with what I know. Now, Lance told him with a wink, sheathing the blades and pointing off toward the horizon. The fiends are likely to be more concentrated in the woods east of the bastion, considering that the fiend wall is that way. Shall we go? She asked him. Affirmative. Hoplite replied.